Hi class, today we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. We're going to review chapters 1 through 9 from the story of the world. So specifically, we're going to be looking at Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India, and just going through each of those places chronologically. So it's going to be a lot of information, but we're not going to go into a lot of detail. It's going to be like hitting the main points of what we studied to just more solidify them in all of your brains. So in Mesopotamia, we're going to be looking at the first kings to Hammurabi. In Egypt, we'll be studying Narmer to the first intermediate period. And then India, we're going to study Manu to the end of the Harappan Civilization. So let's start with Mesopotamia, the first kings to Hammurabi. Okay, so I feel like I'm beating a dead horse because I've said this so many times, but nomads settled in the Fertile Crescent where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were. It was a fertile area and people began to farm there instead of wandering around looking for food. As they did this, they began building houses, which turned into villages, which turned into cities, and as the cities needed to be able to cooperate and learn how to make food and do all of these things together, not just individually. This gave way to need for an authority figure or a leader, and this is when we have the beginning of kingship. And we know this because of the Sumerian king list, which is the oldest written record that we have. And it lists the kings before the flood and it lists the kings after the flood. So the kings before the flood ruled for like thousands and thousands of years, and then after the flood, the times they ruled become more and more normal. And then we talked briefly about the flood and how Susan Wise Bauer calls it probably the only universal story that mankind has, because there are stories of the flood in a dozen different races. Now, all these stories are, besides, I believe, the Bible, of course, they're mythical, or they're more like legends in a sense, like there's stories about talking fish and llamas and things like that, but like the core root of flood just coming and devastating these cultures are very much the same. We also talked about just developments in Mesopotamia. So one of the things that happened in Mesopotamia around 3200 BC is a phenomenon called streaming in. Streaming in was when big groups of country dwellers would move into the cities, and this was not a very peaceful transition most of the time. This gave way to the cities becoming more important than the countries. So no longer you have this egalitarian society, you have the country as like lower and the city as higher. And this is the creation of hierarchy. Hierarchy was also created when the kings began claiming the right to rule based on birth and not power. So you don't become a king because, hey, I can do this cool thing, or I'm smart, or I'm powerful, or conquer these people. It was like, hey, my dad was the king, so I get to be the king. And this creates an aristocracy, which is a class born to rule. So now in Mesopotamia, you have the aristocracy on top, the city in the middle, or just the city in general, and then the country on the bottom. And that's the creation of hierarchy. Writing also developed during this time, around 3000 BC, and the Sumerian writing system was called cuneiform. As you can see in this picture, this is the Sumerian king list, by the way, for those of you who are interested. And cuneiform was first developed to mark ownership, to be able to say, hey, this is mine, don't touch my stuff, even when you weren't physically present. And writing really just revolutionized culture and how people did things, because now you could talk to people when you weren't there, and you could claim ownership on things when you weren't present to do so. You could also now pass down stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh to future generations through writing. And then some of the first wars that started, or the battles that started, were between cities around 4000 BC. One of the more famous battles or wars were fought by Gilgamesh around 2700 BC. And he really was an ambitious person. So he was the king of Uruk, and he goes and he conquers Kish. Remember Kish was like the city, almost the capital, but not. And to be the king of Kish was the highest honor you could have at that time. And so he becomes the king, or the first king to rule 4 cities, Uruk, Kish, and Nippur. Now remember, Nippur was held by Kish, and it was the sacred city where the temples were, and you would go and pay homage to the gods. Anyway, a lot of other battles occurred during this time. We've briefly talked about some of them, like Meskia Gashur and Lugal-Amundu. You don't need to remember those names because they're wonky and there's a lot of them, but just remember that people were fighting. Cities were fighting. A lot of people were trying to gain power, wanted to be the king of Kish, things like that. These battles also included Elamite invasions. Then we talked about Sargon, and his origin story is like Moses in that he was found in a river in a basket, and he's adopted and raised by a Semitic man. His name, Sargon, means legitimate king. It's very highly unlikely that his birth story is true and just something he concocted, because maybe his parents were of lowly origin. Who knows? But he ended up ruling the whole Akkadian Empire, and in order to show that, yes, I am king, yes, the gods have deemed me worthy to be a king, what better way than to name yourself legitimate king and then have this cool backstory where you don't have to account for where you came from. Remember, we have a hierarchy, we have an aristocracy, and he probably wasn't part of that, and he could say, hey, I was sent by the gods in this cool way to become your legitimate king. Anyway, so Sargon is raised by this Semitic man who's a gardener to the king of Kish. He raises Sargon to be the gardener, but Sargon is too ambitious to settle for something like that, so he becomes the cupbearer to the king of Kish. The cupbearer was second in command to the king, and Sargon uses this position to betray the king, stab him in the back, and he takes over Kish. After he does that, he goes and he fights over 50 battles, and he conquers all the rest of Mesopotamia. And through this creates the Akkadian Empire around 2334 BC. Now, we've talked about how Sargon is Semitic. So the Semites are like, think about them as an umbrella, and you have different groups under that. So Akkadian was one of them. So he is Akkadian, different from the Sumerians, have a different language, have a different culture, and so the Sumerians are now living under Sargon's military dictatorship. He puts armies and soldiers in the different cities, and the Sumerians have to live under that rule. Weren't very happy about it. But Sargon also did some cool things like standardize weights and measures in his whole kingdom, empire. And then, however, we have a barbarian invasion during Naram-Sin the Great's rule. Naram-Sin the Great is Sargon's grandson. He is called Naram-Sin the Great because he extends his father's empire to its greatest extent. However, during his rule, the Gutians come in and they end up destroying their culture. They don't replace culture, which is why they are called barbarians. So the Akkadians aren't called barbarians for coming in and destroying the Sumerian culture because they replaced culture. They had their own writing and they had their own inscriptions and monuments and buildings and things like that, whereas the Gutians just came and destroyed things and didn't replace it with any culture of their own. They ended up taking more than half of the Akkadian Empire, and they ruled for more than half a century. This is during the time that Terah, Abraham's father, moves his family, and then Abraham moves his family further to the land of Canaan from Ur in Mesopotamia during all of this chaotic time. And in Canaan, he has Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac becomes the father of the Israelite nation. Ishmael becomes the father of the Arab nation. And then we have the establishment of the Neo-Sumerian Empire. So the Sumerian kings get tired of the Gutians being in their land, and they drive out the Gutians. They reestablish the Sumerian Empire, which hasn't been around for a while, because remember, before the Gutians, it was Akkadian. And so now We go Sumerian, Akkadian, Gutian, back to Sumerian, and we have people like Udahago and Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu is the one that kicks the Gutians out. Shogi, his son, builds the biggest ziggurat in Uruk, which is pictured here. Again, this is not the original, it has been restored. However, the Neo-Sumerian Empire did not last long because of an environmental disaster, which was the catalyst to a lot of issues. So we talked about salinization, how the fields became very salty and they couldn't grow their food. And so they're hungry and they don't have food to sell. Now they can't pay their taxes, and that means that the kings can't pay their army, so they are not well protected and guarded, and the few fertile fields that they have for food are taken over by the Amorites. The Amorites are also Semitic, or Western Semitic people, like the ones in Canaan where Abraham was. So the Amorites are coming and taking over their fields. The Elamites are like, ha ha ha, now is our time for revenge. They don't like the Sumerians very much. There have been battles between the Elamites for a very, very long time. And they're like, hey, they're hungry, they're weak, they don't have an army. The Amorites are also taking over their fields. This is a great opportunity. So in 2004 BC, the Elamites come and invade. This completely ends the Sumerian civilization. There are just a couple kings that keep power. And then those kings and those cities are Isin-Larsa and Ur. And again, this is called the Isin-Larsa Period because of the cities that were powerful. It says Isin-Larsa and Ur, but Ur was taken by the Elamites, and they just and they get defeated pretty early on in this period. I don't know if you remember that video, but there's a lot of like stuff that happens with like this king fights this king and blah 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 blah. Basically what you need to know is that it was really messy. It was really chaotic. There's a lot of power struggle. There's a lot of battles. Think about this time period like a nursery full of just bratty, spoiled kids going after the same toys, saying like, it's mine, and just like squabbling. That's basically what this was. In the end, Rimsin, who is an Elamite, takes over Larsa and defeats Isin. Okay, so the Elamites come in, they get Larsa, and then Rimsin defeats Isin, and he has his little chunk, which is in orange on the map right here. Meanwhile, Babylon is taken over by an Amorite chief and is growing in power. Remember, salinization, Neo-Sumerian Empire destroyed, and then all of these cities that were under the Neo-Sumerian Empire don't have a government, don't have power, don't know how to govern themselves in a sense. We have the Amorites coming in, and one Amorite chief was like, oh cool, it's like a city, like I'm gonna take over it and I'm gonna just make it my own. So this Amorite chief, I think his name was Sumu Abum, takes over Babylon, and Babylon is now growing in power. So that's what's happening in the south. In the north, Shemshi-Adad is growing his Assyrian Empire. Now, Shemshi-Adad is also an Amorite. So remember, Babylon is taken by an Amorite, and Assyria is taken by an Amorite. Remember, they are Semitic. Now, Shemshi-Adad, Amorite, takes Assur, which is a city in the north. He is a very, very cruel leader. He likes chopping off heads and killing people. And he spreads the Assyrian Empire through fear and through violence, and not through like cooperation or negotiation. It's just like, no, I do these terrible, cruel things. I'm going to do them to you if you don't listen to me. So a lot of cities were just like, oh no, Shemshi-Adad is coming. And they didn't even put up a fight. They're just like, please don't kill us and we will submit to your rule. So that's how he established the Assyrian Empire. However, in the north, Hammurabi, which was the great-great-great-great-grandson of that Amorite chief, he's like the 5th king, he defeats Assyria, which I'm happy about because I don't like Shemshi-Adad, and he also defeats Larsa. So he defeats Rimsin, and he takes over the entire Mesopotamian region. And now he says, you know, I don't want to be like Shemshi-Adad. I don't want to be like Sargon. I don't want to rule with fear. I don't want to rule with a dictator leadership. I want to rule with law and through having people do what is morally right. This is what he thought. I want I want people to do what's right because it's right. I don't want people to just do things because they're forced to do things. He believed that he received this law, this code from the gods, and he makes the people obey his law. And you read about some examples in your book, like if somebody builds a house, I think, and it collapses and it kills somebody, then that person shall be killed too. Or like if a doctor performs a surgery and the patient dies, then the doctor shall have his hand cut off. And all of these, some of them make sense, some of them are a little bit questionable in my opinion, but I would like to believe that his motive or intent, like his heart, was in the right place. I don't know. It just seems like a better tactic than Shamshi-Adad just cutting off people's heads. Okay, that's the end of Mesopotamia, all the way from nomad settling to Hammurabi. That is where we last left. Now we're going to move on to Egypt, from Narmer to the first intermediate period. Okay, so King Narmer, 3100 BC, unites Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. He becomes the king of all of Egypt, and he begins the first dynasty of Egypt. We talked about how Egypt is divided up into dynasties and divided up into kingdoms. And so remember that these kingdoms are like books in a series. Like think about the Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, like you have these books in a series. And then the dynasties are the chapters within those. The first and second dynasty, I want you to think of as like the prequel, like the Hobbit or something like that, because they don't fit into any of the kingdoms. So we have the first dynasty of Egypt, and we don't know a ton about the first dynasty of Egypt, except that some of the things that happened during this time was that the government and the economy grew. I also forgot to note that you also have a writing system being developed through hieroglyphs, and more likely than not, they learn about writing from the Sumerians. During the first dynasty of Egypt, kings were buried in underground tombs, and we know that the people must have viewed the pharaohs as a god because of a lot of human sacrifices that were in these tombs, hundreds of people buried with the pharaoh, and it helps us understand their belief system. We talked about the Memphite theology, which is the story of Osiris and Set, and how Set's the jealous brother. He goes and he chops Osiris up and he lays him all over Egypt or something like that. And then Osiris's sister / wife comes and stitches him back up. And then it's just like, give me a baby. So he impregnates her, and he has she has a baby, Horus, and Osiris dies, becomes the king of the underworld. Horus becomes the king of the living world, and the pharaohs believed, or the people believed, that the pharaoh was Horus, and when the pharaoh died, became Osiris of the underworld. And so we talked about mummifications, and if you watch that video that I had linked in my previous video about how one of the reasons they practice mummification may have been because of the Memphite theology, and how Isis takes Osiris's body and she wraps it up, and they were kind of mimicking that, if that makes sense. So the people who said, hey, I will die with the pharaoh and go with him to the afterlife, I don't know if it was voluntary or not, but they must have believed that he was a god and was going to become the king of the underworld. So they were going with him in this duty, or in this new journey, if that makes sense. Okay, so then the second dynasty of Egypt doesn't go so well. It's marked with drought because the Nile floods are decreasing. Now, in the first dynasty of Egypt, the Nile floods are very abundant. Egypt is very, the soil is rich, the crops are great, but the second dynasty of Egypt starts with a drought because of the Nile floods decreasing. Now, if you believe that the pharaoh was a god in the first dynasty, you'd be like, oh yes, my pharaoh is great, he's a god, he's making these floods happen. But if the pharaoh is just like, I am a god, and he's not doing anything about the drought when the people are starving, people are going to begin questioning his deity. And so you can see the pharaoh's power weakening. Civil war breaks out in the second dynasty of Egypt. And then at the very end of the second dynasty, Kassachem reunites Egypt. This starts the third dynasty of Egypt, and it's very, the third dynasty is very prosperous. They're united, and the third dynasty starts the Old Kingdom of Egypt, or the first book, if you will. We think that their views on the afterlife must have shifted, because instead of being buried in underground tombs or in mastaba tombs, which were a departure place into the afterlife, they started building these pyramids, and the pyramids are filled with all of this stuff. So instead of a burial place being a departure place, it became a resting place. So Djoser is the first king who attempts, or the first pharaoh who attempts to build a pyramid, and he builds the step pyramid, which is pictured here. And we think that quite possibly he drew inspiration from the ziggurats in Sumer. There are a lot of other unfinished pyramids that were built during the third dynasty. So if you want to kind of remember, or have a way to remember the third and fourth dynasties, the third dynasty doesn't figure out how to build pyramids, but the fourth dynasty does. And the fourth dynasty is called the Golden Age of Egypt, because this is when Egypt was the most rich and prosperous, and just built a lot of crazy pyramids. So we have Snefru, who builds the bent pyramid and the northern pyramid, and we have Khufu, who, remember, was the evil dude, and he builds the Great Pyramid. We talked about how pyramid building was a sign of power, a sign of, hey, I'm bigger than you are, because I can do this thing that is honestly altogether unhelpful to the economy. Khufu employed the biggest workforce in history at that time, and he's using a lot of money, a lot of people, a lot of resources to honestly build something that's really, really cool, but not really necessary. So these are just these monuments, these signs of power, if you will. It makes me kind of think of like guys, sorry guys, I guess girls do this too, but like guys who are just like, my car is bigger than yours, or my car is more expensive than yours. Like it's kind of like that same mentality. So Khufu's son Khafre builds the Sphinx. Khafre's pyramid is smaller than Khufu's, but he builds it on higher ground, and so it looks bigger. Khafre's son's pyramid is half the size of Khufu's, and then his son, the last pharaoh, is buried in a mastaba's tomb. So you can see like this slow disintegration in the fourth dynasty of Egypt. This brings us to the fifth and sixth dynasties, where Egypt is slowly disintegrating into chaos, and we have to ask why. How do we go from being able to build these like giant monuments to like chaos? And some of the reasons are, again, the pharaohs squandered lives and money on pyramids. Again, pyramids are cool, and I would really like to see them one day, but using all of these people and all of this time and energy and money to build these huge monuments, and then build another one that's even bigger, is not helping the economy. All of these people are not putting all of their work, they're not putting that back into the economy. They're not, you know, building houses for people. They're not planting food and things like that. They're building these huge tombs. And again, that's not helping the economy. We also talked about potentially the weakness in the royal family's genes, because there was so much intermarriage, and I read you that section where they were just related in a lot of bizarre ways. Like one of them was like a mother and a mother-in-law to the same person or something like that. Like just, and yeah, it's weird. And how that caused possibly a lot of genetic mutations and a lot of issues, because we know that close intermarriage with like family members is just not good for your genes, and it might have caused mental illness as well. There was also a drought that happened during this time, and that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. So this takes us into the first intermediate period. So just kind of a word on that. So you have like the Old Kingdom, of Egypt, which are like the books. You have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and in between there you have these intermediate periods. And the intermediate periods are marked with a lot of chaos, a lot of disorganization, a lot of fighting, and different people vying for power. So the kingdoms, you typically have like a specific pharaoh and a united Egypt, and first intermediate periods, or just intermediate periods in general, where everything kind of just goes crazy. So the first intermediate period is where you have the 7th through 10th dynasties, and there are many insignificant pharaohs during this time who just can't keep the throne for very long. We talked about how this is when Abraham was down in Egypt with Sarah, and one of these insignificant pharaohs takes Sarah, and God plagues the household, and the pharaoh gives Sarah back with stuff and a lot of servants, and possibly one of the servants was Hagar, which becomes Sarah's maidservant and also becomes the mother of Ishmael. So that's the end of Egypt, of what we've covered so far. Moving on to India, so Manu to the end of the Harappan Civilization. So we learned about how in India's history, you have 6 Manus, each of them rule for 4 million years, and then the 7th Manu is the one who's warned by a fish about the flood. He is considered the first historical king of India, and he ruled around 3102 BC, and this date is probably inaccurate because it was figured out by a lot of backdating, but this is the one that is commonly used in textbooks and things like that. So in India, you have the Indus River. Remember, ancient people lived near rivers like Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile River in Egypt, and we'll learn about the Yellow River in China next video. But the people in India settled near the Indus River, which was called the Indus River Valley. They were trading with the Elamites, with people in Mesopotamia. We know this because there have been trading posts and seals found. The Harappan Civilization is very interesting because we don't know a lot about them. Their writing hasn't been deciphered, but their cities are so fascinating and so interesting. Their cities have drainage systems. They have these baths, but not temples, and then they have toilets. And even though their cities are spread out all over the Indus River Valley, all of their cities are very similar in their blueprint. They're very uniform. However, there's not a lot of record of communication happening between the cities, like a lot of writing and things like that. So it's very puzzling as to like how they did this, and also why they did this. What did they believe to compel them to make their cities exactly the same and have their bricks be exactly the same measurements and their toolkits to be exactly the same and things like that. Their cities also had citadels, which if the walls of the city were breached, you could run to the citadel and run away. So the Harappan Civilization ends, and there are a lot of theories about how it ended because we don't know why. One of the theories is that they were invaded by the Aryans, and this theory, some people think this. I personally don't. I don't think it holds a lot of water because the citadels were in the cities and were there for the purpose of running away from invaders. However, the cities, there's no sign of struggle around the citadels, okay? There's no soldiers wearing armor. There's no soldiers having weapons. And so there's no indication, I would say, that they were invaded. Some people say there's a flood, but there's really no evidence of certain silt layers that need to be there for evidence of a flood. Maybe it was an earthquake. Maybe there was like illness. Skeletons have been shown to have some kind of thing going on. Maybe they were anemic, maybe they were starving. So there might have been already like illness happening in the cities, and then some kind of environmental disaster happened on top of that compelled the Harappans to leave, or they died, and then a lot of them just fled. They left and they didn't rebuild, which that's why some people are like, well, if it was a flood or an earthquake and some people survived, like why wouldn't they rebuild again? But they didn't. So it's very interesting, very fascinating, very puzzling, and this is why I love history. It's so fun. Anyway, that was a lot of review. Hopefully your head doesn't hurt. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.